of speech, freedom of movement, and freedom of religion. I am also concerned about the role of Switzerland in this conflict. Switzerland holds the largest community of Tibetans in Europe. However, Switzerland has signed a free trade agreement with China without the slightest mention of the human rights. Even our government acknowledges that the situation in China is getting worse since 2013. Even here in Switzerland, the fundamental rights of Tibetans are being violated more regularly since the free trade agreement has been in place, especially the freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and the right to privacy. Furthermore, while our government has not welcomed the Dalai Lama since 2005, it has been deepening its ties to the leaders of China. This is for me not acceptable. Switzerland has to fight harder for the values of democracy and freedom and protection of minorities. I am also troubled by the environmental issues in China and in Tibet. Deforestation, exploitation of soil, diversion of rivers have already brought serious damage to Tibet. The mountain is injured. This needs to change. Therefore, I would like to assure all of you of my full support. We have to continue to try to restore human rights in China and in Tibet. We have to address the international community towards this situation, and I hope that we will achieve a big step today in this direction. I wish you a successful forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mazzone, for those encouraging words. As a token of appreciation, we would like to offer you a small souvenir, a Tibetan tanka of Chenre Sikh, the Buddha of compassion. We Tibetans believe His Holiness the Dalai Lama as the manifestation of Chenre Sikh. I request our Sikyong to do the honor. Thank you. With this, we would like to conclude the opening session and then move on to the panel sessions. I would love to invite on stage Kai Müller. Kai Müller is the Executive Director for International Campaign for Tibet, Germany, to moderate the first session on the topic Human Rights Situation within the PRC under the CCP rule.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you all here to this panel on the situation of human rights in China from a more general perspective. We are having 5 panelists this morning in this first panel. I'd like to introduce them now and ask them up to the stage. First, we have Ms. Min Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell is a veteran journalist. She is the managing director at Radio Free Asia for East Asia, based in Washington, D.C. Would you please come up here? Then second, I'd like to invite Mr. Wu Kaishi to the panel. He is a democracy activist who has been very much involved at the student movement at Tiananmen Square in 1989. He is now a political activist and commentator based in Taiwan. Would you please also come up here? I have Professor Drew Gladney, who is a professor of anthropology at Pomona College in California. He is an author of a number of books and numerous articles on Asia with specific focus on ethnicity and culture and on, in specific, the Uyghur people. He's based in California. Then I'd like to invite Mr. Thupten Sampo, who is the director of the Tibetan Policy Institute based in Dharamsala in India. He was formerly the secretary of the Department of Information and International Relations of the Central Tibetan Administration. Lastly, Mr. Engebatu Togoshok, who is the director of the Southern Mongolian Information Center based in New York. Mr. Togoshok has been living in the US since 1998 and has co-founded and co-created this, the Southern Mongolian Information Center in 2001. So we're going to have a discussion, a couple of presentations, taking altogether around about 1 hour and 45 minutes, perhaps until 11:30. A little bit overtime, I think, is permitted. We are having sort of oral presentations, partly by PowerPoint, partly verbally. So I'd like to start off with Ms. Mitchell and ask her to give us a sort of bird's eye overview of the past years of political developments with regard to human rights and rights development in China under those first years of Xi Jinping, who has now been in power for 5-6 years now, which falls into the same cycle as this UPR, which we are looking at next week. So please, Ms. Mitchell.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. I'm very honored to be on the panel today. First, I'm sure many of you know generally about Radio Free Asia, but let me briefly introduce our work. Radio Free Asia is a U.S. congressional-funded news organization whose mandate is to serve as surrogate media in closed-off countries that lack free flow of information and press freedom. So, thank you. RFA focuses on covering news that local people would not be able to hear or watch otherwise. We broadcast in Mandarin, Tibetan, Uyghur, and Cantonese in East Asia. And I want to thank many of you here today who help our mission by taking our interviews and providing us valuable information to report on. As someone whose job is to follow human rights development in China closely, this frankly has been another disappointing and discouraging year. It is not news to anyone in this room that the trends in China under President Xi Jinping have been going in only one direction, downward, and no sign shows it's improving. Human Rights Watch correctly calls it broad and sustained offensive against the rights of people in China. It appears quite clear that Xi Jinping's China dream is all about building up the glory of the state, or more specifically, the Communist Party, and not about the dignity of the individual. His China leaves no space for independent thought, open debate, or respect for anyone's human rights except those at the top of the Communist Party. We can go down the list, which of course only scratches the surface of human rights challenges in today's China. First, you all have followed the ongoing crackdown of human rights lawyers in China. The crackdown of labor movements, protests, and underground churches. And more so recently, massive level of censorship on mainland, particularly on internet, to the point where Freedom House just yesterday credited China for the 4th consecutive year with the dubious distinction of being the world's worst abuser of internet freedom. And China is considered widely the first state to build digital dictatorship. Indeed, one wonders about the confidence and stability of a country that feels it must prevent its people from information, from truth, in order to feel secure. Likewise, how fearful about legitimacy must a regime be to resort to developing an all-pervasive Orwellian surveillance state in order to feel confident and strong? That refers, of course, to China's massive, brutal aggression against the Uyghurs. Communist Party Secretary Chen Quanguo, who came to power in Xinjiang in August 2016, had rolled out one harsh policy after another targeting the Muslim Uyghurs, using many of the same tactics he pioneered to suppress ethnic Tibetans. Many of you know very well what happened in Tibet in those years that he was in power. RFA is proud to have been among the first to break the story about Uyghur re-education camps. Although I'm very sad to say one of the reasons why we were able to do so was because our members in Tibetan service in Washington had family members, because they work as a journalist in America. Their families were detained or missing back home in Xinjiang. And on Tibet, we will soon hear from many experts in this room today about the relenting abuse of Tibetans and the Tibetan culture. So I'm not going to go deep into that. But while there is little to say that is positive right now, it is encouraging that the world appears to be catching up to the realities of Xi Jinping's China and are increasingly speaking out. I think while we must recognize the power of Chinese financial influence, the world is also beginning to wake up to the connection between what is happening inside China and developments outside China. How China treats the Tibetans or the Uyghurs will not remain an issue merely for the communities. It represents the way China will treat its neighbors or anyone, anywhere that feels getting in the way of the country's, or more precisely, the party's power and glory. And China is demonstrating its model to other states around the world. At the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping was explicit about it, and I think the world should take his words, should just take him at his words. In fact, Beijing is already exporting to other countries the high-tech tools of surveillance state being tested in Xinjiang. It is a matter of time before China begins to promote to other countries, assigning social credit system to citizens and restricting human rights accordingly. As China is already using its vast financial resources to shut down free speech and debate in free societies, all in the name of respecting Chinese people's feelings and China's sovereignty. As Sikyong just pointed out, a really neutral quote from His Holiness in a car advertisement, selling a T-shirt of a map without Taiwan. Not listing Taiwan as Taiwan, China in business websites, or inviting His Holiness to make a commencement speech in a U.S. college. All these things now you have to apologize to China. And from this, you see why we think these are all really dangerous stuff for all of us who cherish human rights and human dignity. As I said, people are waking up to this. But China, as we know, will continue on undeterred and at least as long as Xi Jinping is the leader, and perhaps regardless. So for those who question what kind of power China will be as it rises, I say look no further than how Beijing deals with its own people, with its scholars, students, dissidents, artists, as well as the population in Tibet and Xinjiang, for evidence of how China will act as it rises. And I think we're at this critical moment that we've seized a lot of international attentions on China's human rights abuses and violations. Despite what China leaders like to say, I think this moment is not about anti-China, let alone a containment strategy against China. It is about the people in China. And I hope today we'll have a very fruitful discussion so that we can put forward, help to put forward strategy and policy recommendations. So I'm very honored to be sitting here with colleagues who've dealing with these issues for decades. Now I'd like to hear from them.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mitchell. Wu Kai-shi, what is your view from being closer to People's Republic with your view from Taiwan?
Oh, yes. Well, Taiwan, of course, being, well, first, let me take this opportunity to say good morning, bonjour, and dashi dalek, and salam. And then ni hao. So, well, my very complicated background give me this opportunity to use these languages. And then also like to, I'm Uyghur by origin. Often that's been neglected that I'm a democracy activist from China. I consider myself a Chinese democracy activist. And actually being I'm a Taiwanese citizen these days, and then they have one big common, and together with everybody in this room, that we have a mass enemy that is threatening our lives. As Chinese citizens, Chinese people, Taiwanese, Uyghur, Tibetan, and everybody in this room. And then I think I would like to echo Sejong's speech, and then he says, you know, we have been warning the world about that very fact. And then we hear people say, you know, China is around the corner, and then at that time we will say, no, it's already in your living room. And then they will say, oh, there's coming around, but we're going to engage them, and then we're going to change them. That didn't happen. We keep telling them the story of what happened in Tibet, what happened in East Turkestan, what happened in the grand soil of China, and then we want to tell them how unbelievable the situation is in China, and then I think the Western world took it literally. They decided not to believe it. What we really meant to say is that what happens here in China or any part of it, and then it will happen everywhere in the world. And then I think to answer your question, living in Taiwan, we see that very clearly. And Taiwan being a country that has been living under this threat for the last several decades, understood this better. And nowadays, China tries to infiltrate Taiwan in every way, but I think Taiwan is one democracy in this world that stood up against China the best. Although Taiwan is also very much economically dependent in China. But when China's infiltration on Taiwan's media, for instance, they bribe the tycoons to buy up major media outfits in Taiwan, and then they will broadcast whatever the Chinese Communist Party want them to, fall into no one believe in it. And their political parties backed by Chinese Communist Party carries no significant influence in Taiwan. And then freedom is like air. It's like oxygen. You can't live without it, but you keep breathing it, you get used to it, you don't feel the existence of it. That's what happened in Western world. But in Taiwan, I would like to report to you and to answer this question, freedom is a substance that we fought for in the last many decades. So it is very much in presence of our feeling. So Taiwanese people wants to defend their freedom. They're doing their best. But guess what? Taiwan has been left out, although being one of the most advanced, most vivid democracy in the world, has been left out by democracies. Why? United States, well, this goes back all the way to the, let's say, Nixon era. The United States and then the Western world, led by United States, struck a deal with China in the 70s, well, and then decided to include China, to be nice to China, and that deal has been escalated later. But actually, the route to see how a dictatorship, communist dictatorship, became what it is today, you can really go back, trace it back to Nixon time. Well, Nixon died 71 years old in 1994. The real framework developer, the real framework engineer is this person called Dr. Kissinger, who's still very much alive, 95 years old, and becoming fabulously rich, brokeraging American company to China, minimum $1 million a case. And then this kind of a person, a brokeraging and becoming fabulously rich kind of person, the structure he framed in 1970s have the influence of leading the world, treating China like what it is treating today. And that, my friends from the West, you should feel a little ashamed. And of course, I point my finger more to the United States on this case, but then the Western world, you should be able to speak your mind. After all, you are democracies. Learn from Taiwan. But then, the deal that the Chinese have made after Tiananmen, in order to continue this structure that Nixon, Kissinger has structured, engineered, is to say, okay, don't sanction us, because after 1989 there was a sanction. They said, don't sanction us, include us in your system. So we will become part of your system, and then you will benefit from it too. That's the deal the Chinese government struck with the world. And then the world, guess what? Fall for it. It doesn't sound like a bad deal, although we, the dissidents from China, the Tibetans, Uyghurs, have been telling the world, no, they will never honor their words. They didn't, and then it's a false deal. And not only they did not give the world the benefit that we were hoping, at this time they have come around, taking advantage from this deal. The Great Firewall, the internet censorship blockage door, and then for a long time the Western world decided to neglect that, to say, okay, that's just China being China, Communist Party being Communist Party. Of course they will censor their words. But then recently the United States realized, wait a minute, that's not just Chinese government censoring their own. That is a business blockage, hurting United States, where Yahoo, Google could not have their advertising market in China because of Great Firewall. It's one example, but I'm glad with this business-minded president, the recent president of the United States, they're coming around with this business interest mind to say this is not a good business. But of course, we are also equally worried that the United States-led Western democracies still treat the relation with China as business. We worry it's an interest-driven relation, where it always should be a value-centric relation. After Tiananmen, Chinese government has also struck another deal with Chinese people. Because right after the massacre for 2 years, 1990 and 1991, Chinese economy went downward, went down. Most people would think China had the economic growth in the last 40 years since Deng Xiaoping. Actually, there were 2 years Chinese economy went down, not only because of the world sanction, but also the Chinese people fall into the stage not to cooperate with the government. And then the Chinese government say, okay, we're going to strike a deal with you, with Chinese people, that we're going to give you your economic freedom in exchange of your political cooperation. Now, cooperation. Submission, that's basically what they mean. Then that deal, of course, is a lousy deal. Both political freedom and economic freedom belongs to us to begin with. They're trading our freedom with our freedom. But we took that deal. The Chinese people took that deal. And then the world also took the deal that China have made. The deal that they made with Chinese people is a bad deal. The deal they made with the world is a false deal. And what does it do to Uyghur people? I mean, to the Chinese democracy movement, to the Tibetan people, we know. We're not here to report on human rights abuses. I'm not here to do that because I believe in this room most people know those abuses exist. We know there were 150 plus Tibetans self-immolated, and then the world did not outrage. We know they incarcerated more than 1 million Uyghurs today, and then the world's outrage is not there. I don't know what happened to this world. You probably, if you can answer it, you are much smarter than me. But there are deals, bad deals and false deals that have been struck and then didn't go through. And then I think it's time for the Western world to wake up. I would like to point out that the China policy, the Western democracy, have been followed in the last 30 years. It's called appeasement. We had that in the history, and we should remember what it led to us. I'll stop my speech now and then now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wu Kai-shi. Indeed, I'd like to move on to Mr. Thupten Sampel, who is going to talk about something more inward-looking at the PRC, but nevertheless quite fundamentally important for vulnerable groups as Tibetan and Uyghurs, which is the policy development in the sphere of religion and culture, which has been very much in the focus over the past years, also by the Chinese government and the Communist Party. Please, Thupten Sampel, could you please give us an overview of those developments?
The Department of Information and International Relations and the Office of Tibet, Geneva, for providing me and my colleague, Mr. Tempekenzela, with the opportunity to attend and participate in this extremely important conference. And this has given us the opportunity to meet old friends, make new friends, and hear the views of scholars and experts. So for some time, I have been grappling with the steps that are taken by China to prepare for a post-14th Dalai Lama scenario. For most Tibetans to think about Tibet and the Tibetan people without the 14th Dalai Lama is unthinkable. But actions taken by Beijing, how Beijing can make the succession struggle in its favor. So this is ongoing research, and hopefully it will be turned into a monograph. So allow me to read the introduction to my research. While the world watches with bated breath how the trade war between the two largest economies will play out, a more consequential contest is being waged in the mountains of Tibet. The struggle between Beijing and Dharamsala for the soul of Tibet and how the Tibetan people will react to the outcome will reshape relations between church and state. It will establish norms on how far the state could intrude into people's private beliefs and their faith. this struggle is centered on Beijing. Beijing does not want the 14th Dalai Lama, but is determined to appoint the 15th. And these are the steps taken by Beijing on how it could appoint the 15th Dalai Lama. The first is that in 2007, Beijing made an announcement regarding the measures it can control reincarnating Tibetan Lamas. So the essence of these measures is that without party approval, no reincarnate Tibetan Lamas will be recognized by the state party and the Chinese government. Those who reincarnating Lamas who desire to reincarnate would need to submit a reincarnation application to the party. The second step, as far as I know, was made in 2016. The Chinese Communist Party made a database of reincarnating Tibetan Lamas who are approved by the Chinese government. Till now, there are 870 Tibetan reincarnate Lamas who are approved by the party. And so these are the documents. On the ground, China is grooming young reincarnate Tibetan Lamas headed by the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama to toe the party line in the ultimate succession struggle to succeed the 14th Dalai Lama. So this is the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama, Venerable Khyentse Norbu, and he is being promoted by the Chinese Communist Party to, in terms of making platforms, forums for him to participate and to make him more acceptable to the wider religious community. And this is a new academy China has constructed, developed, and established near Lhasa. It is in a place called Chushu. So the purpose of training these young, important incarnate lamas is to make them to the party line, to China's appointment of the 14th, of the 15th Dalai Lama. So these are some of the steps taken by China to prepare Beijing to make the Tibetan people accept China's appointment of the 15th Dalai Lama. So Beijing makes its claim to appoint the 15th Dalai Lama on history. Beijing's claims of having the right to appoint the next Dalai Lama is based on its perceived sovereignty on Tibet, on the specious argument that the Mongols and the Manchus exercise sovereign rights in Tibet. This is the same argument China is advancing to justify its current claims of sovereignty on the South China Sea and on cyberspace. There is a robust U.S. pushback on China building islands in the South China Sea and weaponizing them. In the Western democracies, there is alarm over China's claims of sovereignty over cyberspace and making good on these claims. The same alarm should goad the international community of religions to push back on the Chinese Communist parties treading in areas where angels dare not. If the party's claim for the post-14th Dalai Lama's succession struggle succeeds, this will reshape relations between man and God. This will allow the party to exercise sovereignty over heaven and earth. The spiritual and political importance of the institution of the Dalai Lama is highlighted by the role it played in the warm trilateral relations between Tibet, Mongolia, and Manchu China. During the reign of Kublai Khan, Tibetan Buddhism remained a court religion. The third Dalai Lama converted the whole of Mongolia to his school of Tibetan Buddhism. Mongolia's absolute devotion to the Dalai Lamas of Tibet largely kept the peace between the Mongols and Manchu China. Similarly, Beijing's determination to appoint the next Dalai Lama is triggered by its hope that a pliable Dalai Lama will help it rule Tibet, legitimize that rule, and make it so much less expensive. If Beijing succeeds, and it is a big if, in weaponizing the institution of the Dalai Lama, this would uproot the Buddhist lineage tree on which rests the sanctity of the Dalai Lamas of Tibet and other Tibetan Buddhist masters. The Buddhist lineage tree helps today's Tibetan Buddhist masters and students through their previous ascending teachers to trace the teachings of the Buddha right to the feet of the Buddha himself. More than the Buddhist lineage tree, the devotion and trust the Tibetan people place in the Dalai Lama and other lamas derives from the tireless spiritual efforts of the lamas themselves. Through lifetime of study, meditation, retreat, and practice, lamas illuminate human existence to their followers, and in the process have attracted millions of students across the globe, including in mainland China, where there are an estimated 300 million Buddhists. Excuse me. By claiming that it alone has the right to appoint the next Dalai Lama, China hopes to make a grab at the cultural and spiritual attractions of Tibet's Buddhist civilization. It hopes to reap the enormous international goodwill and devotion to the institution shown by successive Dalai Lamas down the centuries and across continents. In attempting to do this, China is following the same strategy it has applied to the efforts of the Mongols and Manchus. China is crediting to itself the imperial accomplishments of the Mongols and Manchus, who have done so much for the present cohesion of the People's Republic of China. So, what does His Holiness himself think about the issue of his succession? After all, he is doing the reincarnating. Left to himself, His Holiness says that he would like to be the last Dalai Lama. He says many times he'll be very happy to be the one who ends the Dalai Lama lineage. But he said in a statement made in 2011 that he would leave the choice and the decision to the Tibetan people themselves. So he has made the statement, and I would like to quote. If it is decided that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama should continue, and there is the need for the 15th Dalai Lama to be recognized, responsibility for doing so will primarily rest on the concerned officers of the Dalai Lama's Contemporary Trust. They should consult the various heads of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions and the reliable oath-bound Dharma protectors who are linked inseparably to the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. They should seek advice and direction from these concerned beings and carry out the procedures of search and recognition in accordance with past tradition. I shall leave clear written instructions about this. Bear in mind that apart from the reincarnation recognized through such legitimate methods, no recognition or acceptance should be given to a candidate chosen for political ends by anyone, including those in the People's Republic of China. So this is the stand of the Tibetan people as voiced by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So here are some policy recommendations, and these policy recommendations are not made by Tibetans. These policy recommendations on how the 15th Dalai Lama should be recognized, accepted, are made by liberal Chinese thinkers in China. In light of this, Beijing should consider the suggestions offered by liberal Chinese thinkers and scholars. Wang Lishong, an independent writer based in Beijing, said that the Dalai Lama is the key to the Tibetan question. In 2008, in the backdrop of the peaceful protests that swept Tibet, more than 300 Chinese scholars and thinkers, including Liu Xiaobao, the late Nobel Peace Laureate, signed an open letter to the Chinese government saying they supported the peace overtures of the Dalai Lama. This letter was supported online later by thousands of Chinese students and scholars. Several years ago, Jing Wei, a professor at the Central Party School in Beijing, told Asia Weekly, a Chinese language publication in Hong Kong, that treating the Dalai Lama as an enemy is alienating all 6 million Tibetans who believe him to be the living Buddha. She said China should avoid the embarrassing situation of 2 Dalai Lamas. She recommended that China should restart its stalled dialogue with him. And this, I believe, is food for the party's thought. And as far as I'm concerned, I sincerely hope that these recommendations will be seriously considered by China. Thank you.
Thank you to Msampala for this very important sort of view on what is one of the most, if not the most fundamentally important questions for Tibetans and future of Tibet. And I think we're perhaps going to be able later on to elaborate a little bit on this in a Q&A session. I would now like to ask Professor Drew Gladney to present his views on the situation of the Uyghur people, and in specific in connection with the Belt and Road Initiative. Please, Professor Gladney.
I'm very, very happy to be here. I feel honored, and I feel I really don't have the right. Many of the speakers on these panels have risked a great deal of their lives and their families to speak. I approach this as an anthropologist and a scholar, and trying to make sense of what's happening in eastern Turkestan and what the results of these draconian policies will be. We need to take this off. Is that, I need to get it off. Anyways, if we can get this going. Yeah. No? Still slow. Technical problems. I had a nice lunch with Jean Wei, whom you just mentioned, a professor at the party school. And I know she has been criticized heavily for his positions. Maybe just clean out the, maybe, is there a way to, it's always technical difficulties. I don't know if we can put it on my computer, but I think the concerns are what exactly is happening in Xinjiang. There have been rather limited travelers' reports, satellite photos. People have left these re-education centers. The government has finally, after denying them for months, has finally recognized that they exist. They're calling them vocational schools and training centers. For some reason, I'm not sure why, I was allowed back to China recently. I spoke to many academics and some people on the street about this. Most everyone I spoke to thought that they were actually schools and good things, for good opportunities for Uyghurs to learn better Chinese. That's what they said to me publicly. Privately, I won't make any names here, but I would argue, there we go, that it is of great concern to many scholars and private citizens in China about what is going on there. I think we're already there. And there is significant concern that it will, maybe we could just do it like this. Yeah, okay. Does this work too? I don't know, maybe I'll have to lean over here. Yeah, I wanted to point out this map that I bought, and I think I'm okay here. Yeah. Okay, well, as long as people don't seem to spook themselves. I don't want to hold you responsible for what I'm about to say. This map that I purchased on October 1st in 1983 in Amsterdam clearly records this place that is now referred to legally as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China as Ust Turkestan. So this area for many years has been known as that area, and it's the Uyghurs continue to refer to that as that region as Eastern Turkestan. I think we should remember that. But the Belt and Road Initiative has brought this region, which used to be thought of as a backwater or border area, to be at the heart of Xi Jinping's new initiative. And that's sort of what I wanted to talk about today. What project I'm looking at is its effects, not only on the region known as Xinjiang today, but also on its neighbors, and on the pressures on particularly Uyghurs in the diaspora. My basic conclusion is that this huge initiative of the Belt and Road is the primary reason, in my opinion, why these re-education centers has been pushed forward. I think our colleagues are absolutely correct that some of these ideas were tried out in Tibet first, but not to the scale that we've seen in Xinjiang, mainly because of the importance to this region, to this grand BRI scheme. And so it's important to recognize that Xinjiang lies at the heart of this crossroads, traditionally, historically, the ancient Silk Roads, but now the modern, I called it the iron or iron-fisted Silk Road of Xi Jinping. And at the center of this is what is known as the Xinjiang problem. When I started studying this region 30 years ago and traveling there on a fairly regular basis until early 2003, nobody really talked about the Xinjiang problem. People knew about the Tibet problem. And if you talked about Tibet, everyone knew where it was in the West, and most people were very concerned. But over the last 10 years, 20 years, certainly, the Xinjiang problem has become very prominent, and I'm happy to find that the region has been increasingly the focus of a great deal of outpouring of scholarship and attention. These are some of the reasons. This book we produced in 2004 highlighted many of these issues. Things have changed and developed. That book is what helped to get me blacklisted from China, and as well as 13 other scholars, or we were called the Xinjiang 13. I've not been back to that region, Xinjiang, since 2004, but I have been able to go back on a limited basis and just return. I wanted to share some of my observations. But I published a recent article that's online. You can find it through the Hoover Institution, in which I argue that indeed Xinjiang is both belt, or both bridge and barrier to this initiative. Whether what happens in Xinjiang will completely stop it remains to be seen, but clearly what's happening and the rising attention to these detention camps, gulags, however you want to name them, is, I believe, giving the Chinese Communist Party serious problems in the publicity over this initiative. And while I was there recently in China, I collected a few items to suggest that the Propaganda Bureau of the Communist Party is doing its best to spin this and to suggest that this is beneficial to the region, and that it's actually being welcomed by the locals, and it's improving their lifestyle. And this is inconsistent to what Western reports, like the one I wrote, are revealing about what's going on. It almost reminds me, coming from the United States, of turning from CNN to Fox News. Completely two different versions of the same event. And also, there are several here who were brave participants in the Tiananmen June 4th events, and we all recall the image of the man standing in front of the tanks. Well, if you go on YouTube today and you ask to see that image in the video, the Chinese version will come up more often than the Western version in English, and it will say, this proves that there was no massacre because the tanks did not run over the man, right? And so therefore there's two very different versions of the same event, just like we're seeing with Fox News and Trump. I think from an anthropological perspective, what we've seen about what this region is being interpreted is based on a knowledge production effort that went into the post 9/11 scenarios of the terrorism threat in the world, and not just in China, and was used as a basis for Sino-US anti-terrorism cooperation. Several of us, when these policies were promoted, wrote about it, that we did not know that there was such a terrorist threat, and indeed found much evidence that there was something that was going on that was not really organized terrorism. This Etim group was not behind everything, but there was increasing violence in the region that nobody can deny, particularly through 2009 and 2015. Indeed, it's probably the reason that Chen Quanguo was brought from Tibet to Xinjiang to try to stop this escalating violence. There's some very good reporting by RFA, by the World Uyghur Congress, by the Uyghur Human Rights Organization that you can look to, that records and documents this violence. But I think it's this knowledge production in which large research centers were established throughout China and the world, really, Singapore and even the United States, that brought the world's attention to this and argued that there was this operating terrorist organization that was leading and promoting and coordinating it. I've testified to the U.S. Congress on several occasions about this, arguing that there was no such institution, there was no such organized terrorist threat to China. The U.S. did change its policy about its recognition of that one institution. But later, the war in Syria went on, and some of the Uyghurs who were caught up in that conflict on many sides, not just one side, were promoted as being homegrown terrorists that might come back to Xinjiang. And so this huge security apparatus is based on that. But if you look at what we wrote earlier in 2004 about the conflicts and the threats, it's really arguing that it's Chinese policies themselves that are promoting the problems, not outside terrorists, not provocateurs, not organized terrorist organizations. And it's Chinese policies themselves. Now, writing things like that got me banned in Beijing, and it's a stamp you really don't want to see on your passport if you want to travel to China. But not just myself, a large number of Western scholars who basically recorded their observations, and it's basically worked in a sense that many scholars who would have worked in Xinjiang, or students come up to me and they say they're afraid to write about Xinjiang and learn Uyghur in case they can never do work in China again. This is a statement by one of the members of the Xinjiang 13 who says that she will never work in Xinjiang again. I have been able to, through this Belt and Road Initiative project, to go back to China and participate in a couple of conferences to give my perspective. I've tried not to pull any punches. I've tried to talk about what I see as counterproductive in this policy and how it will generate many, many problems in the future. But many people forget that in this policy there is this area in the southeast, which is really another important corner of the Belt and Road Initiative for the maritime part of it. And that is an important area to me because it's where my father served during World War II as a flying tiger who flew the hump pilot. And it's what got myself interested in going to these border regions of China. I don't know if this map is working. I guess maybe it's not moving, but I hope to create a moving map that, yeah, I think it is moving, but I don't think we have time to watch it. It will be on my file if you ever want to look at it. It's thumbing developed at the Pomona College Pacific Basin Institute that I ran to try to show that these border areas of China were rarely part of China. And Xinjiang itself, as I indicated in the earlier slide, was only named Xinjiang in 1884. I keep telling my Chinese colleagues, if you want to say Xinjiang has always been part of China, you need to change its name, because it means new region in Chinese. And really, it wasn't until the People's Republic of China established its rule through the PLA that it has been fully incorporated into China. And what's happening now, I think we can see, is an effort to extend what I'm calling a third wave of Chinese development under Deng Xiaoping, then Jiang Zemin. Was basically that wave was to develop this region, particularly to rectify China's energy needs, to sustain its development. What some people are calling is leading to a cool war. Now others are calling for a new Cold War between China and the U.S. I think that's rather facetious because a lot of other people are brought into this conflict, this trade conflict. Particularly Europe is very much engaged, and India as well. But a cool war, certainly a trade war, is important. But critical to all of this is energy to sustain China's developmental strategy and trajectory. And one of the key aspects of this, realizing the China, I'm told by my own timer to stop, so I'll move this up, is the Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping's Iron Silk Road, which runs through this area. It's hugely invested, 74 countries, 1.4 trillion. But I want to point out the fact that Xinjiang is the critical crossroads to the success of this region, so to this whole initiative, which has run into problems in other places, now Pakistan, Malaysia, Colombo and Sri Lanka, and in other countries in Europe that are realizing that this could be debt trap diplomacy, and that it could be leading to all kinds of other problems that are not on the surface. There are upsides to it. There is funding and development. The U.S. has withdrawn from many of these parts of the world. China is asserting itself. But at the crisis in the center of this is what I would call, and Chinese have called, a 4 Cs, a Sihai. John Liet. And the reason it's called the initiative, not a strategy, is the word John in Chinese has a war-like tone to it. And so calling it an initiative basically changes the way China can present this strategy to the world. I don't think I'm going to have time to go through this, but I was going to compare China's experience with the U.S. westward expansion, and that in both cases they had low populations in their west, but through rail and road development, the U.S. developed its west, and so China's done the same with its road and rail development. Xinjiang has returned to be the pivot of Asia, what Owen Lattimore once called it, through this Western Development Program. The one critical issue that I've pointed out to many of my colleagues and students is its population, unmeasured trampling of the region by outsiders. And all Chinese scholars, this last chart gives you a Chinese publication recognizing that in the 40s the population was only about 7% Han, now 38%, probably more like 50% Han if you count all the undocumented Han in there. And I don't have to talk to you in Europe about the problems of unmonitored, untrammeled migration. For Xinjiang, it's been overwhelming. And this is the issue, I think, and it's only become more of an issue due to the Belt and Road Initiative, and it'll exacerbate all the other problems, environmental, religious, ethnic, etc., unless the government does something about this trampling of its region by outsiders. I think Benedict Anderson said it best, it's imagined communities. China is an empire that's seeking to be a nation, and now it's extending its control. Through the Belt and Road, we can see its securitization of the region to make it secure through this kind of harmonious society. I think, and others have written, that the use of terrorism, and it proved work for the United States, why not China? Terrorists can be useful for increasing security budgets. But I think we all here have to recognize that the Uyghurs have been caught up in the middle of this, and in the diaspora have always called for a peaceful solution, have always abandoned violence and argued against it. And really it's the anti-succession laws directed initially towards Tibet, but also, and Taiwan, but also that is involved in Xinjiang. And finally, I just want to take a page from the cover of my first book to remind people here that Muslims were allowed to protest in China before Tiananmen, officially approved by the government. This is the cover of my first book, and this was a slide that I published, a picture of Uyghurs, Hui, and I think Kyrgyz, holding up permission to protest in China. So Uyghurs have tried to use lawful means, public means, to peacefully express their concerns. I urge them to continue to do that. I will conclude very quickly and argue that this is globalization with Chinese characteristics. If you know what some of those characteristics are, it should make you nervous. It's top-down globalization, and also Xi Jinping is expanding this road globally, but tightening the belt domestically. A lot of people don't like this Belt and Road term, but I think it says very clearly what's going on that the government is trying to do. I think I'll stop there over my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gladney. I'd have some immediate follow-up questions to a very interesting presentation, but for a moment I would like to move on to Engebatu Togoshok, who is going to give us a presentation about, unfortunately, similar experiences in southern Mongolia, or the Mongolian people in the PRC. Please start with your presentation. Yeah.
talk a little bit about the background or brief history of Southern Mongolia and the deteriorating human rights condition in Southern Mongolia. So first of all, where is Southern Mongolia? Who are Southern Mongolians? Southern Mongolia is always known as Inner Mongolia as a result of the Chinese word, direct translation of the Chinese word called Neimangu, which covers the vast territory of the so-called Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region and Mongolian inhabited areas in neighboring Chinese provinces. And Southern Mongolia is an occupied nation, like Tibet and East Turkestan, and here I would like to emphasize that this is an occupied nation, not an occupied territory, because for the fact that Southern Mongolia had fully functional self-governance, military diplomacy up until the Chinese invasion in 1949. And the total population of Southern Mongolia is 6 million, including the 4.5 million in the so-called Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region and in the other areas in the neighboring Chinese province. And it's located in southern tip of Mongolian Plateau, and it's a land of nomads, and pastoralism flourished there for thousands of years. And therefore, pastoralism is the very foundation of Mongolian culture, tradition, way of life, and even a national identity. So, but after the steady waves of Chinese migration starting 1949, today the Mongolian population is only 20%, and then almost 80% are Chinese. So Southern Mongolia is, as I mentioned earlier, it's in the southern tip of Mongolian Plateau. It's a typical steppe climate, and average altitude is about 1,200 meters, and average annual temperature is minus 23 to 26 Celsius, and average rainfall is very low, 50 to 450 millimeter, and it's very arid and semi-arid grassland suitable for pastoralism or herding animals, not really suitable for large-scale farming. So, as you know, there's a Great Wall. If you look at Great Wall, it's a real clear boundary between the traditional historical Mongolia and China. It's not only the national boundary, but also it's a boundary between the two different climates. You know, if you go north to the Great Wall, the climate is totally different. And then there's also, of course, the boundary between the two different civilizations. You know, Chinese civilization is typical sedentary civilization, and Mongolians are typical nomadic civilization. So let me give you a brief history of political oppression and ethnic cleansing in Southern Mongolia under the Chinese Communist regime. In as early as 1940s, Chinese carried out the so-called land reform movement in Southern Mongolia, and thousands of Mongolians were killed during that moment. And then in the 1950s, China carried out the anti-national rights movement. Thousands of Mongolian elites were purged in the late 1960s through 1970s during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And the Chinese government carried out its state-sponsored large-scale genocide against the entire Southern Mongolian population. This is also known as the purge of the members of the Southern Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party. It is estimated that at least 100,000 Mongolians were killed and 500,000 persecuted, and one-third of the Mongolian population is affected by this genocide. And for those who are interested in reading more about the genocide, actually recently I published a book called Genocide on the Mongolian Steppe, which is an English translation from Professor Yang Haiying's Japanese book called Bohyonaki Sogen. It's available on Amazon and some other major booksellers. So, in addition to these political purge and genocide, ethnic cleansing movement, Chinese colonial regime also carried out a series of policies of land acquisition or land grab. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1940s, the land reform was carried out, and then Chinese peasants started to seize and own Mongolian land. That started in 1940s. And then during the 1950s and 1970s, grassland was cultivated, and the large-scale state-owned farms and Chinese farms and forestry set up in southern Mongolian grassland. And then in the late 1970s through 1980s, Chinese adopted the policy of land privatization. And traditional way of Mongolian way of collective land management is abolished, and grassland, which certainly degraded contribute to the grassland degradation. In 2001, Chinese government declared that the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region is open to all Chinese investors from all part of China to open up land for mining and cultivation or tourism. So many Chinese companies poured into southern Mongolia. And starting during 2000 to 2010, and Chinese government also launched the so-called Western development and Western energy to the east. During this moment, Chinese state-run and private companies rushed to southern Mongolia, and grassland has been further devastated. So let me talk a little bit about the Chinese government attitude toward the environmental problem. Chinese government is always very hostile toward the Mongolian traditional way of life, and that they call it very backward, archaic, irrational, unscientific way of life that need to be abolished or replaced by the Chinese more advanced way of life. So the Mongolians who lived in a perfect harmony with the natural environment in their land for thousands of years are now blamed for the environmental degradation. So Chinese came up with the terminology "guodu fangmo," overgrazing, which is a myth in what Mongolians say. This is a myth created by the Chinese authorities to justify their hostile attitude and discriminatory policy toward Mongolian way of life. Well, in Chinese authorities' vocabulary, there's no guodu gengzhong or guodu, over cultivation or over mining. Well, with these all well advertised justification, hopefully not for me. The Chinese government also adopted two major legislations toward the Mongolian traditional way of life. One is called ecological migration, or Shengtaimin, which is adopted in 2001, aiming to displace entire Mongolian herders from their ancestral grazing lands to predominantly Chinese populated urban and agricultural areas under the name of recovering grassland ecosystem. So we don't know exactly how many people are displaced. According to the Chinese State Council website, by 2015, Chinese central government aimed to resettle the remaining nomads population of 246,000 households, or 1.157 million herders. That, of course, include mainly Mongolians, Tibetans, and some Kazakhs. So this is, population, and still, I think it's still on Chinese City Council website. And so they publicly claim to end the Mongol, the nomadic way of life within the border of the People's Republic of China. So another policy that the Chinese authorities adopted is called the livestock grazing ban, or Jinmu in Chinese. Under this policy, the grazing livestock on grassland is considered a crime, punishable by livestock confiscation, large amount of fines, and detention, and even imprisonment. The government deployed a special task force called Livestock Grazing Ban SWAT team. It's an armed force. It's called the Jinmu at all rural level governments to patrol the grassland, to issue fines, arrest herders, and confiscate livestock. So thousands of Mongolian herders are arrested, detained, and even imprisoned. This is in 2001 when the so-called ecological migration project started. They are demolishing Mongolian herders' fences, and they they are arresting herders who are resisted the ecological migration, and they are livestock was confiscated by the Jinmu, and this is 2001. Even 2018, still they are doing the same, and confiscating the Mongolian herders' livestock regularly. And so, in addition to this, another problem in southern Mongolia is energy, the mining problem. In 2009, Chinese government announced that southern Mongolia is China's largest energy base, and indeed, world's 95% of rare earth is from southern Mongolia's Box City, and China found the largest coal reserve in southern Mongolia, which is like 676 billion tons. And China's largest natural gas reserve of 700 million tons is found in Ordos Basin of southern Mongolia, accounting for 40% of China's total gas reserve. So also Chinese government stated in 2012 that they found world-class uranium deposit in southern Mongolia. So other than that, there's a lot of gold, gold, silver, and other minerals are found in southern Mongolia. So we see this as a resource curse, because the local Mongolians never benefited from this natural wealth. Chinese mining companies, including the Shenhua, Daqing, Datang, occupied large tracts of Mongolian herders' grazing land, and thank you. So, and thousands of private miners rushed to the Mongolian grassland and opened up mines randomly. The most of the mines are, especially the coal mines, are open pit or open cast mines, with destroying large pieces of grassland in southern Mongolia. For example, the Holingol coal mine is become China's largest open cast coal mine. Here's this is the scene of how the mine is destroying the Mongolian grassland. So this is also in southern Mongolia. Look at this. This is the beautiful grassland is destroyed like this. It will not going to be recovered in 500 years, 1,000 years. they just leave it like this and then left. These are mostly the ninja miners, small mining companies. So in addition to this, also, pollution of air, soil, and water is a very serious problem in southern Mongolia. And this is an image actually published by the Chinese on the Chinese website, and this is a scene near Holingol coal mine. Look, what is very ironic is that this is concrete statue, actually not the real sheep and goats. Chinese government, on the one hand, they are just banning livestock grazing, and then on the other hand, they are just, setting up the concrete image and fooling people that Mongolian, grassland is still beautiful, and this is another scene of like open cast coal mine in Ujimchin, and the water is polluted, and they dump the industrial waste directly to the grassland, and these are the livestock poisoned to death by toxic waste. And so Mongolians pay very heavy price for China's the so-called opening up and extractive industries in southern Mongolia. So I think probably my time is up, and well, I can continue during the Q&A if you have any questions. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Engelberto, for this presentation. And I do have a number of questions. I would just like to start off this round, this Q&A session, with a couple of questions. Of course, there are probably a lot of questions for every speaker here. But I would like to ask two questions, actually, to Professor Gladney and Ms. Mitchell. Drew Gladney, it really struck me when you used this term knowledge production, and which sounded quite familiar at second thought to me, because we as human rights advocates here in Geneva in particular, and also looking at our specific issues, we've come across a number of new sort of words or sort of terminologies and narratives used by the Chinese government, particularly here. If you look at the new word judicial sovereignty, which the Chinese government has been using for quite some time now. So internment camps are being called vocational training centers. A grazing ban or discrimination of economic activity is called now. It's development and progress. We particularly see that in terms of Tibet as well, where this top-down authoritarian development approach is being termed as something positive and progressive. Would you say this is a distinct strategy of the Chinese government? And if so, how should Western governments react towards this strategy in terms of countering such narratives? And a question for Ms. Mitchell would be, you've been talking about digital dictatorship, about sort of the new sort of quality of repression in China, which we've all have been witnessing over the past years. If I just take the legal developments, there have been a number of laws that have been passed, such as the cybersecurity law, the so-called anti-terror law, the security law, the laws on NGOs, then the revised religious regulations, which have a very distinct effect on Tibet as well. So my question would be, how does the Chinese citizen on the street, how do they react? How do they view this sort of massive expansion of state intervention into their own private sphere? How is the reaction? What's their take? And does it have any repercussion for the Chinese government or their policies? So if you could please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that back in, because I am about to go to Brussels to be part of an all-day-long conference talking specifically about the so-called vocational centers or re-education centers. This emphasis on education is really, I think, deceptive because education, everyone is in favor of education, right? I mean, we all want to be more educated. And yet, this is really, you know, a deceptive view. It's not unlike the Confucius Institutes being a part of China's soft power, again, promoting Confucian values of education and rational discourse. The problem in this case is it's top-down education, it's the state's view, and there's very little, there's almost no opportunity to raise questions, to dissent. So I think the role is to produce counter-narratives that are based in as much evidence as possible and personal stories, and talk about experiences of families and individuals who've been caught up in this net. And that's why, you know, using other terms, or at least asking and pushing for greater access, for greater openness, for testimonies of those who have been through, is one of the main things we can do, particularly is in a public fora, in civil society, and to keep trying to have open dialogue. I think that's one thing that has not happened at all for the Uyghurs. There have been moments in Chinese history and recent history for some levels of dialogue with Tibetan issues. There's been nothing like that for the Uyghurs. And I would hope that government representatives in this room would support that idea, that why there cannot be an open discussion with many voices at the table. I've been to many conferences where there are only Chinese and Westerners, or other conferences when there are only Uyghurs and Westerners and others, but rarely do we have Uyghurs, Chinese, and others, other governments and government representatives and scholars ever in the same room discussing these, raising their opinions, citing evidence that can be made public on both sides. Most of the Chinese I spoke to in my recent trip to China had no idea what was going on in the region and basically thought that education's good. You need to learn Chinese to succeed in China. You need to be developed. So I think these terms have many, many different meanings, and they have to be openly debated and shown for what they really are.
Yeah, so you asked a very interesting question. So how do the Chinese think about this massive expansion of all this digital cyber technology that's taking over most of their lives? So we've done quite a few interviews, of course, with Chinese interviewees. A lot of them do worry that the country is going to become a police state. And of course, they know you know, they never had a country that has privacy or respect privacy, but a lot of them are aware that this is elevating the situation to a different level. But interestingly, there are also a lot of younger generations in China. They consider this a sign of progress of the country, that they can enjoy so much convenience that brought by the technologies. They have their phone, their life is on their phone. They think it's more advanced than Europe, than America. You know, they pay with their phone and all this stuff connected, and they believe, even with the social credit system, a lot of people think this is, you know, if you don't do anything wrong, why would you be afraid of it? Why would you think it's not a good thing? It's a good thing to protect good people, a good thing to punish the bad behaviors. So to that, that's why I think our job is very important. Free information flow, free press is very important at this stage today to counter the Chinese disinformation on all these things. And same thing as the Uyghurs, they've been telling domestic audience how that's a vocational training camps, which was a total lie. Yeah.
May I steal 2 minutes? Thank you. If it is the wording, the terminology that Chinese use, vocational center, re-education center, to describe the camp, the massive incarceration happening in my home country. Well, there are a few facts of those camps that we should just can help us easily make up our mind what it really is. Uyghur people are taken there against their free will. These camps are enforced by the police. They have no freedom in there. They cannot call their family. They cannot just walk out of the camp, go home. They may die in there. Actually, in fact, many people have already died in there. And then when I say they may die, I'm talking about it may sound again unbelievable or not believable that I say they may all die in there. Knowing Chinese government, they do not have the skill to back down from a mistake they made, especially when the world accusing them, they will just insist, say there's no such a thing. And then I do not see at this point, how do they let those people in the vocational re-education center come out from 1 million of them, if not more. So, and then another fact is it's not for brainwashing. That's another thing I think the Western researchers and press has not getting. It's not like a lot of people say they try to brainwash Uyghur people to let them sing all the communist songs and do a recital all the communist documentation. Those things ordinary Chinese don't even believe. You cannot brainwash someone forcing them sing songs and learn a language. What the purpose of this camp is simple, is to break Uyghur people. That's what it is. And then if they can't, imagine what they can do. But okay, that's the fact of these camps. I want to elaborate, but let's make up our own mind what we should call it. Re-education camp, vocational camp, whatever. Chinese government will call that. We shouldn't. We shouldn't follow that, and then we should call it exactly what it is. It's concentration camp, just a gulag or Nazi type of concentration camp aimed to break Uyghur people, and then it may escalate the situation, end up killing all of them. And then if, yes, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. One last question before I open the floor. There's already some interest, which is good. Tupten Sampala, one thing that really I think is of interest for a lot of people is how do you, first question, how do you view the Vatican's agreement lately with the Chinese Communist Party on the state of the Catholic Church with regard to naming bishops in the PRC? And another question, there's been another term being used very frequently by the Chinese government, which is the term Sinicization of religion. And what would be your take on what this will have, what kind of effect will this have on freedom of religion and also on the sort of state of mind of the Tibetan people, if you will, or the Tibetan culture?
On the Vatican's recent deal with the Chinese Communist Party, I have written a small piece on this, and I titled this piece, the Vatican has made a deal with the devil. Because in terms of this Tibetan history and the efforts made by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he has successfully separated church and state. So no interference from politics regarding how people worship, what their beliefs are. Now here, with the Chinese Communist Party, they are this mingling, people's beliefs and increasing the ability of the state to, dictate what people should believe in. So, so Vatican's recent deal with China has strengthened the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to dictate the same terms regarding the succession struggle. So this, I believe, is something which is wrong. I hope I'm wrong myself, but my sort of superficial viewing of the whole deal is that Vatican has made a big mistake, and it has strengthened the hand of Beijing to appoint, bishops who are amenable to their terms and conditions. So this is my sort of short, superficial view of this whole structure. And your second question is? The effect of... Oh, yes. So I think, this, in many ways, I believe it sort of indicates the insecurity of the Chinese Communist Party to, synthesize, every religion. Religion is a set of universal values. You cannot nationalize any religion. So this, I think, sort of reflects the depth of the political and cultural insecurity of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you very much. I would now like to open the floor for questions. And if you have a question, please press the button on your microphone and briefly identify yourself. There's one.
Alison Reynolds, International Tibet Network. It was really a comment harking back to this question about terminology, which I think is fantastically important, and it was great to see Ngabatu emphasising Southern Mongolia as an occupied nation, not an occupied territory. I think that many of our governments use language that they think will be more acceptable to China. So I think looking ahead to the UPR, lots of comments about ethnic minorities, and I think a real push on all of our parts has been to ask governments to name, these peoples that are being affected at the moment. So we want to see the word Tibetans, we want to see Uyghur, we want to see, many of those words spelt out. And I think it's very important that we don't allow China's terminology or preferred terminology to slip into our own vocabularies when we're talking to governments.
Thank you. There, over there, on the right-hand side.
Hello. I have comments. I'm from the media. I would like to just inform you, all the people, that thank you so much for informing us all the things, the violation against the Mongolian, Tibetan, and Uyghur people. But you have to remember this. There is a place, it's called Balochistan. China is also violating human rights values here in Balochistan against Baloch people. So I am also Baloch, I am from the Balochistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this remark. Anybody else? Questions? If not, then I would just like to put a question to everybody on the panel, and that's also connected to one big project, which is very much in the focus about Belt and Road Initiative, also to the many legislative initiatives and the laws being passed over the past years. The question is, how secure is Xi Jinping with the implementation of all of these policies? Is he really the strong man, or is he really so much or so safe politically that he can just charge through these mega projects without any issues or questioning of his leadership? A question that comes to our mind as human rights advocates on a regular basis, because where repression is always a sign of insecurity, because you cannot apparently trust, or there's no trust that can be invested into the people that are targets of repressive measures. So there's always a flip side to repression. And also my question would be, is the perception a correct one that Xi Jinping is so safe in his saddle? Perhaps, I don't know, who wishes to take this question? Drew, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of criticism over the summer and directed towards Xi Jinping. I think once he changed the law so he could become basically president for life, most people thought he had completely consolidated his authority. He had been carrying out anti-corruption campaigns, which were clearly targeted at his personal political enemies. He certainly hasn't rid China of corruption, but he has definitely attacked many threats on many fronts to his own personal authority. Nevertheless, over the summer we saw from many angles, not only with the slowing Chinese economy, and a lot of his authority, his legitimacy is derived from this constantly growing economy, which the trade war has, affected to some degree. How he manages to continue that, I don't think they can just shift production and sales to other countries. But certainly the Belt and Road is part of the initiative to divest China from its reliance on the U.S. and a few other countries for exports. And it's shifting of outsourcing of some of its labor costs with the rising costs of labor and life in China. It's extraordinary inflation. So I think he's found a lot of vulnerabilities through this program. I myself noted a lot of people raising questions, not just internationally, but in China domestically, a lot of complaining that the cost of living, that low salaries, lack of freedom, lack of travel, restrictions on visas, real restriction on cash flow outside of China, and that's really cutting back more on the ability of the business and other oligarchs to send their money and their families abroad. That's led to a lot of anger towards Xi Jinping by the elite and by those who have been succeeding in his system. There's going to be a lot of blowback. And personally, I don't know if I said very accurately, but I believe that this repression through these so-called vocational centers will be very counterproductive. The one thing I kept hearing was, well, you see, we had all these problems until 2016. Until Chen Quanguo came to Xinjiang, we had almost every week some kind of violence, not just in Xinjiang, but in Yunnan and in Beijing, and now it's stopped. So it must be working. We've had 2 years with no major violent incidents. And I said, well, look at what happened prior to 9/11 in the United States. We had thought we had won the war, and on terrorism and all that. I'm said very regularly in very many venues in China that this will be unintended consequences and counterproductive. They may get people to say, give lip service, to say what they need to say, to be able to leave these concentration camps, but it's engendering an enormous amount of resentment, not just among the Uyghur and others that are caught up in these camps. There's also Hui and Kazakhs and some Han, but also internationally, and not just among the diaspora communities, that it will be very counterproductive. And already we're seeing a Confucian Institute after Confucian Institute being closed, people finding out what their real motives are, and now, of course, many countries involved in the BRI resisting it, trying to lay down conditions, even Pakistan, which is the most sort of subdued as a trading partner with China, to actually stand up, and also other countries like Sweden refusing to extradite Uyghurs, increasing numbers of Uyghurs receiving asylum in places like the United States. So these are unintended consequences of these actions, and I think that this will only increase.
Thank you. Kashi.
Yes. I would also like to answer this question. How is she doing all this, what he's doing, trying to consolidate power? Is he like repression is always a sign of insecurity? I totally agree with that. But I think the Western world has had a problem on how to look at China altogether. I think this panel this morning, we have established one fact: the Western world have been naive. We have established that, we just haven't established how naive the Western world is. The Western world is looking for a different tactic to deal with the Chinese Communist Party. They want to understand Xi Jinping himself. They want to say, okay, what's the ultimate goal of this regime? These questions are very good questions, but basically, my answer to all these questions may, again, make you feel unbelievable and then decided not to believe and continue your naivete. That's what I'm worried. To look at Chinese regime, there's no other way but to see them as a group of bandits. They seek power and use that power to loot. That's it. They're a group of common thieves. And they have no ideology. No. They have, of course, not like, they don't even care about the party's future. And nobody in China believes in communism anymore. And then they think Xi Jinping is probably a person who wants to glorify the country because that's what his slogan is, right? He said, let's have the new China, to glorify the nation. That's his tactic to stay in power, to loot more. And that's it, nothing really more. Actually, for the Uyghur issue, that's also the basic core of it. After 1992, Deng Xiaoping's tour to the south, the deal that I mentioned the Chinese government made with Chinese people in exchange of political freedom will give you economic benefits. And that has also brought a lot of economic resources to, let's say, Xinjiang, this area, because, for all the reasons, but that's the consequences. So at that time, the party chief of Xinjiang, Wang Lequan, he decided to grab the power, because power at that time means more economic benefit, means more he can loot. So what happened is he deprived the political power, little political power that Uyghur people have left, or designed for the decorative purpose before 1989, and then they used the slogan of ethnic unity. He decided to deprive Uyghur people from those power too, so he can again loot more. So that is kind of against the Chinese government's official policy. So what does he do? He decided to increase the tension between Uyghur people and then the regime. And he called Uyghur people a terrorist. So he put central regime in the position to back him up. He basically blackmailed the central regime with his anti-terrorist campaign against Uyghur people. The result of that is, of course, giving the thugs more power and deprive Uyghur from their life, basically. So Uyghur people living in a poorer life. So hence, the more increased confrontation. And he enjoys that. That leads to the 2009 incident in Urumqi, the massacre. Many evidence shows that the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous regime at that time, the government had all the power to prevent that. They didn't. Not only they didn't prevent the July 5th incident, they incinerated many of their power to make sure it escalated into the level. Same thing happened in China today. So anybody who believes, who's looking for a tactic or idea, to understand Xi Jinping, you need to understand he is nothing more than a common bandit. And then there is only one way to deal with them: fight against them, apply pressure. That's the only language they understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this remark. There's one more question from the floor, and I would like to give participants the opportunity to put a question there, please.
Good morning. Christina Alney with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C. Thank you all very much for your presentations. I'd like to go back to some points that were made by Dr. Sangai in his opening remarks, and that some of you on the panel also commented on, which is the last 20 years of the West's relations with China. As we've heard and as you've said, the political and economic incentives that we've given China to liberalize and cooperate, including the most favored nation status, have not worked. So my question is, in this new era of competition with the West that Vice President Pence specifically highlighted in his recent remarks, what should be the framework for the West's relations with China, and specifically for the United States' relations with China? And I'd like you to comment in particular on the One China policy and how the US and Europe can cooperate to change the decision-making process in China, which is what is going to have to happen for the policy outcomes to change there. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Ingeborg Togoshok would like to respond, and please limit yourself to just a few minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, it's a very interesting and actually it's a fundamental question that when it comes to China problem, China's issue. So I totally agree with Orkashi about how we should look at China. So personally, I do not have any faith with any benign leader in the Chinese regime who can save the nation or who can give freedom to the occupied nations and to Chinese citizens. So there's a very interesting development or trend in the past decade or two in China. One interesting trend is that, of course, because of the mounting pressure from the internal problems, Chinese regime are having a sense of instability. That's why they come up with a lot of, Weiwen or all this, maintaining stability. That word language, so very common in Chinese news media and press. So that's because they becoming increasingly unstable regarding the regime's own problem, legitimacy, and that's one because of the internal problem. And then, but on the other hand, and China is increasingly confident in the international community. For example, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when every time Chinese leaders visit the United States or European countries, there were a lot of protests against Chinese government, and of course Chinese government had some sort of feeling of shame or but now they are increasingly confident, very confident that they even organize counter protests and everywhere they are very confident in promoting their own ideology. Why? Because mostly, again, so-called democratic nations, countries, governments, they are spoiling China. They really, China is, to them, China is kind of spoiled child or rich kids that they can do whatever they want, and then even whatever they advocating is nonsense, but they have to think about it. For example, this year, right, Chinese government urged so many airline companies to use China's Taiwan. And then so many companies did consider. And then you look at the United Nations. Still, I mean, they have to look at Chinese faith, if China is angry or happy, or so in some sense, United Nations is helping China, place on NGOs to make sure that these NGOs embrace the Chinese ideology, use the Chinese terminology. So this is so sad. So on one hand, China is lacking confidence internally, but having more growing confidence in, the international arena.
In dealing with China, I would like to recount the 13th Dalai Lama's experience of dealing with China. So he told his experience to Sir Charles Bell, who was the dealing British officer whose jurisdiction covered Tibet, Bhutan, and Sikkim. So the 13th Dalai Lama said that his experience was that if you make concessions to China, China would expect you to make more concessions. So he said any dealing with China should be uncompromising. I wouldn't know whether this would work in today's world, but this was the 13th Dalai Lama's his experience in dealing with China.
Thank you, Min Mitchell, and then Kai-Shi, and I wouldn't mind if you could finish on a positive note somewhat.
Yes, so, well, mine is a very quick comment and question to all, is, yes, we all agree the Western governments have been probably too naive about who China is, what China is, but because of that, my positive note is China took off the mask. So we're here today. There's so much more attention this year. I'm sure you can all feel that there's some kind of momentum going on for what you do, for what a lot more attention on human rights defenders' work. So do you see this? How do we seize this moment, and how do we use this, this attention to advance the agendas? And yeah, I think it could look like China is too confident, but I think deep down it's insecurity that in the top leadership that caused all these things going on. So I think we, for the following couple sessions, we can keep discussing this, but now we see what China is.
Thank you for the wonderful question, and then I'm the one who come from Taiwan, and then I thank you for mentioning the One China policy. You're mentioning the Vice President Pence's speech, and then indicating shift of the China policy of the United States. I have been accusing, I have been, pointing my finger to the United States and to blame the United States for the Western democracy's 30 years of appeasement policy. And I appreciate the question you have pointed out. It's time to stop. And then, but I particularly appreciate the question you ask for, like particular suggestions. Revisit most favorite nation status. Although after WTO, it's no longer it seems no longer valid on the business point of view. But revisiting it put United States in a position to initiate dialogue with China on values, on human rights, on democracies. And then I think it is time for the world to forsake sovereignty above human rights policy. And the United States can certainly kick off that dialogue. And then with that, if a sovereignty, because of the sovereignty above human rights policy that the world has adopted, we have Tibet issue, we have Uyghur issue, we have mass human rights abuse issue in China, and then we have the appeasement that the whole world is facing. So revisit all the trade agreement with China linked with human rights, linked with very specific political reform demand, and this time, wait for the answer. In the past, human rights dialogue has been also a decorative sort of a gesture by the Western countries when they send their trade delegations to Beijing. They just, we're democracies, we have parliament, we have media. We have to draw this question to you guys. We have to say human rights, but don't worry. We don't wait for the answer. Imagine what kind of message that sent to the Chinese government. And then that's what nurtured China to today, which is the reason that I blame United States, and it's time to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I'd like to, as we come to an end, like to thank the Central Tibetan Administration Office of Tibet for organizing the space for civil society here, for the experts here at the panel. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope this has been a fruitful discussion for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the speakers and moderators. Since we are a little behind schedule, I request everyone to reconvene at 11:50. We will now take a short break. Please help yourself with tea and coffee outside. Thank you.